This is Friday, January the 22nd. This is American history. Now, we know during the administration of Grover Cleveland, this would be his second administration, that the Spanish are going to send in the troops under General Weyler to bring the Cubans back into line. All this did was mostly stir up the Cubans. Now, the Cubans themselves are looking for independence. And in 1897, which would be McKinley's first term, General Weyler and the troops of the Spanish government are going to be removed. But Americans are reading in their newspapers that Cubans want independence. Now, the question is, how badly has the economy of Cuba been damaged? And what would happen if the Spanish soldiers came back? American businessmen are going to call upon President McKinley to do something. And in 1898, President McKinley is going to do that. President McKinley is going to send the battleship Maine, and it will sail into Havana Harbor. Now, the battleship Maine was one of those battleships that had been created during Cleveland's first administration, but had not actually seen the sea until Harrison. So by and large, the Maine was a fairly new ship. Now, the idea is pretty simple. The Maine will be in Havana Harbor, and the Maine will carry more than normal number of Marines. And these Marines could be used to protect American businessmen and to protect American interests in Cuba. Now, unfortunately, the Maine is going to blow up. Now, one of three scenarios is most likely given. The first scenario is that the Maine blew up because it was a tragic accident. We know that the coal bunkers for the Maine and ships of that time were right next to the ammunition areas. And the belief is that the coal ignited by spontaneous combustion, and it created enough heat that the powder blew up. A second scenario is that the Spanish blew it up, that the Spanish brought in a mine, and the mine blew the ship up. The third scenario is that the Cubans blew it up in hopes that the United States would go to war. Well, the last scenario might make sense if the Cuban people had access to high explosives, but they didn't. The second scenario makes no sense at all, because if the Spanish blew up the ship, then most likely this would cause a war. The most likely scenario is that the Maine had a tragic accident. Now, this video here talks about the death and explosion on the Maine and the people who were killed. Now, here is the map that we have in our possession, and here is Cuba right here, this rather large island just off the coast of Florida. Well, with the Maine blown up, American newspapers are going to call for revenge. William Randolph Hearst will say it best when his newspaper will say, "To hell with Spain, remember the Maine." And it is obvious that the United States has war fever. It's been a long time since we've had a war against another country, the last one being the Mexican-American War during that time of Polk. President McKinley, in the spring of 1898, will call for retributions for the Maine and Cuba independence. Now, McKinley knew that Spain would not agree to either one, so it is pretty obvious that we're going to go to war. There were people in McKinley's cabinet who are urging him to go to war. One is this man here, Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt is the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Now, Roosevelt has had a meteoric rise in New York politics. He is going to become one of the youngest state assemblymen in the history of New York. He is going to be the youngest state senator in the history of New York, and that includes up to present day. And New York Republicans were looking for a way to get rid of Roosevelt, because Roosevelt was a progressive. The feeling was, let's let Roosevelt go to Washington, D.C., where he will be forgotten about. And Roosevelt was given the post Assistant Secretary of the Navy. This is the #2 job. But when the Secretary of the Navy got sick, it is up to Roosevelt to run the department. Roosevelt believes that there will be war. And so Roosevelt is going to call for an American fleet to leave San Diego and go to Hong Kong. Now, here again is our map, and Hong Kong is located right about in here. Now, the target is this group of islands right here. These are the Philippines. The Spanish fleet is divided between its two colonies, Cuba and the Philippines. And Roosevelt believes that it's important to destroy the Spanish fleet in the Philippines before the Spanish fleet can attack Hawaii and West Coast cities. When war is declared, Roosevelt will send a telegraph to the American fleet in Hong Kong, and Commodore Dewey will take his ships and head to Manila. Now, Manila is the largest city in the Philippines. This is where the Spanish fleet is housed. The orders are to attack the Spanish fleet, destroy them, and then capture the Philippines. Now, Dewey felt with the ships that he had, he could accomplish the first. But capturing the Philippines was going to be a little bit more difficult. In the summer of 1898, Dewey will sail into Manila Bay, and in one of the most famous quotes in naval history, he will turn to his gunnery officer and say, "You may fire when ready, Gridley." The American attack on Manila Bay saw the destruction of the Spanish fleet without the loss of any American sailors. But now, Dewey has a bigger problem. Dewey doesn't have enough Marines on board his ships to stop the Spanish from escaping Manila and going to the various islands that make up the Philippines. Dewey decided to make a deal with this guy. This is Emilio Aguinaldo. And Aguinaldo is a Philippine freedom fighter who is looking for independence for the Philippines. Dewey will make a deal with Aguinaldo. Aguinaldo and the Marines will join forces to keep the Spanish bottled up in Manila. Now, Dewey did not have this authority, and Aguinaldo naturally assumed that when the Spanish gave up, the Americans would give independence to the Filipinos, which isn't exactly what happened. Aguinaldo believed that with the defeat of the Spanish, he would get independence. But in the summer of 1898, a contingent of American soldiers arrived, and they took the place of the Filipinos. The Spanish army will surrender to the United States, and the United States will determine that the Philippines should be a territory of the United States. For going back on its word, Aguinaldo and his freedom fighters vow revenge on the Americans. It is sad to say, but more Americans died in the Filipino insurrection than died in the Spanish-American War. This video talks about this episode in American history. But the big event would be in Cuba. Now, the idea was that each state would create its own National Guard. and that the National Guards of each state would be trained by the state, and then they would be assigned to the invasion of Cuba. Now, the United States only had about 28,000 men in uniform before the Spanish-American War. Now, this is small. This is incredibly small by European standards. Most of the 28,000 men were out in the West fighting the Indians, and over half of those fighting the Indians were black. Now, the jumping off point would be in Florida. What would Southerners think of black army troops coming through the South armed to go off and fight the Cubans? Well, nobody knew. President McKinley will call for volunteers, and it's almost a stampede by each state to get its National Guards trained and down to Florida before the war is over. Now, one of the first units to arrive were the Rough Riders. The Rough Riders were a group of soldiers from the territories of Arizona and New Mexico. They were commanded by a New Yorker by the name of Leonard Wood. Now, there is a military fort just south of Jefferson City named in honor of Leonard Wood. Now, one of Leonard Wood's closest friends was Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt. When Roosevelt is offered the number 2 position in the Rough Riders, Roosevelt will resign as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he will become a major in the Rough Riders. Now, as Roosevelt comes to Florida for training, Roosevelt will bring some of his chums, as he called them, some of the elite sons of the various trust barons of the Gilded Age. Now, to capture Cuba, the first thing we had to do was we had to get from Florida to Cuba. But the problem is there aren't enough ships to do this. Well, Roosevelt is going to use his pull, and he's going to get a troop transport that will take his men from Tampa to Cuba. Now, once in Cuba, the Americans will land outside of the largest city of Santiago. It is here, along the seacoast, that the Americans enjoy the sights of daiquiri. Now, soon, Americans were taking ice and crushing it up and adding Cuban rum with fruit juice to create a cocktail called a daiquiri. Now, everybody knew the only way you could get to Santiago was to capture the hills that surrounded it. These hills became known as the Heights of San Juan. The task was given to the Rough Riders and the 9th Cavalry, a group of black soldiers under the command of Captain John Pershing. Pershing is from Missouri. The Rough Riders, units from New York, and the Buffalo Soldiers will scale the heights of San Juan. This is one of the great victories that is looked on by American soldiers today. This video is going to talk about the attack of San Juan. By August, the heights of San Juan are attacked and taken by the Americans, and now the Spanish fleet is forced to leave Santiago Harbor. As the Spanish fleet leaves Santiago Harbor, they will be annihilated by the American fleet. With the Spanish fleet at the bottom of the ocean and the Spanish soldiers on Cuba either captured or killed, in 1899, the Spanish government will call for a peace treaty. It becomes known as the Treaty of Paris. Now, after this, we have to put the number 99. This is the 3rd time that we've used the Treaty of Paris. Once for the French and Indian War, once for the American Revolution and now for the Spanish-American War. Spain agrees to give Cuba its independence. Spain agrees to give Puerto Rico in the Atlantic, Guam in the Pacific, and the Virgin Islands in the Atlantic to the United States. The United States agrees to pay $20 million to the Spanish. However, at the last second, there was an addition to the Treaty of Paris of 1899, and that addition said that the Philippines would be given to the United States as a territory. Well, the United States Senate is going to debate the treaty. There are many people who are opposed to the treaty because of the acquisition of the Philippines. There are those who say that taking over the Philippines is an imperialistic act. The question is, will the Senate go along and approve the Treaty of Paris of 1899? Now, it is that treaty that we will start on Monday.